December 6th. When Joachim woke up Sunday morning, it felt as if he had just fallen asleep, for he hadn't realized once during the whole night. He hadn't woken once during the whole night. Then he realized that he had dreamed, and as soon as he remembered the dream, it seemed to him that the night had been a long one after all. He had dreamed that the magic advent calendar was filled with small chocolate figures that turned into real animals as soon as he opened the doors. To stop them from running away, he had to lock them up in a secret box, and he only let them out on Christmas Eve. Then all 24 chocolate animals crept out through the window and set off through the countryside. They were going to Bethlehem, because that's where the Christ child was born. Joachim sat up and laughed. He was ready to open the 6th door of the Advent calendar. Today there was a picture of a round tower, but he was looking more closely at the picture afterwards. First he had to read what was on the piece of paper. Casper. When the boat with Elizabeth, the angel Epheriel, Joshua, the shepherd, the 3 sheep touched land on the Danish side of Øresund, they were welcomed politely by a well-dressed man. Elizabeth spotted him first. "There's a man over there." The angel glanced. "Well, then he is one of us." The man was black and was wearing a dark cloak with gold buttons, red knit pants, and sheepskin shoes. He came towards them and pulled the boat up on land. The sheep were the first to jump out, and soon the pilgrims were all standing on the beach. The man wearing the fine clothes bent down and took Elizabeth's hand. "Greeting to you, my child, and welcome to Shealand. My name is King Casper of Nubia." "Elizabeth," said Elizabeth, curtsying politely. She wasn't quite sure how to behave. Perhaps she should have said that her name was Elizabeth Hansen and she came from Norway, but that wouldn't have been very interesting, since he told her he was a king. "He's one of the wise men from the east," whispered Epheriel. "Or one of the 3 kings of the Orient," said Joshua. None of this information made the situation any easier. If she was going to say anything, it would have to be that she was the Princess of Toten or something. Then maybe the king would have believed that Toten was a mighty kingdom. The king bowed again and said, "The pleasure is on my side of Øresund. You should know that I've been standing here waiting for you for so long that in the end I had to play hopscotch between 1701 and 1699. That was puzzling. So puzzling that Elizabeth had to rub her eyes to see if she was awake. It was difficult enough to play hopscotch between squares on the pavement. How could a wise man play hopscotch between 2 different years? He explained, "When I arrived on the shores in the year of our Lord 1701, some fishermen appeared, and they were so dismayed when they saw one of the wise men that I had to take a step back. That's how I got to the year 1700. I sat down and looked over the Øresund, but after a while a couple of soldiers on horseback came from the fortress. They too were dismayed when they set eyes on a black man. You see, at the moment, I am the only black man in the whole of Denmark, at least the only one who is also the king of the Orient. That sort of thing attracts attention. People find it hard to become used to something completely different. So I hurried back to the year 1699. And since then I have been waiting here. I have seen neither man nor beast, and I have had no need to hide from the sun and moon, from the stars in the sky either, for the stars in heaven are so close to God that they would never permit themselves to gossip about the life of humans on earth." Elizabeth didn't know whether she understood everything he said, but she did see that she was talking to a very wise man. He was so wise she didn't know where to look. So it was a great relief when the shepherd thumped his crook on the ground and said, "To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem." The little procession moved off again, the 3 sheep, Joshua and Casper the Black King next, Elizabeth and Epheriel last. They leapt along broad cobbled streets in the big city. Epheriel explained it was Copenhagen, the king's city. It was so early in the morning that the streets were almost deserted. Elizabeth thought it was nice to see such a big city without any cars, but you had to put up with horse droppings that were fertilizing the streets. Elizabeth was used to seeing that only when she visited her cousin. The time was 1648. It's the last year of Christian IV's reign. He became the king of Denmark and Norway when he was still a child, and that was many years ago. Of Norway, too? Well, Norway, too, because Norway is part of Denmark at this time. It was Christian IV who founded Kristiansand and Kongsberg and gave Oslo the name Christiania, too. He's very fond of Norway and has visited the country often. They soon arrived at the center of the Danish capital. They stopped in front of a church. That's the round tower, which King Christian has just built onto the new Trinity Church. Even though the church towers look imposing, he thought they would be made better use of. So the round tower has been built both as a church tower and as a watchtower, where astronomers can work in peace and quiet, studying the movements of the planets and the position of the stars. For these are the days when the first telescopes are invented. That's a strange mixture. She felt that she, too, had to say something clever every now and then. The wise men shook his head. The stars are created by God, so studying the stars in the sky can be like a whole church service, but here they have neither deserts nor camels. She stared at him and asked what he was talking about. The best way to study the stars, in the opinion of all wise men, is to sit on the back of a camel in a desert. It's almost like sitting in a tower, but a camel can move from place to place, a little like the castles on a chessboard. The only thing that's difficult for a camel is to go through the eye of a needle. She looked at the wise men in astonishment. She was not at all sure if she agreed that the back of a camel could be compared to a church tower, nor was she so sure that a desert could be compared to a chessboard. Elizabeth looked at the wise men in astonishment. Caspar cleared his throat. The drawback of a watchtower is that it usually stands stock still. I have myself seen a tower that stood in the same spot for more than 1,000 years. The old walls must get bored with the view. On the other hand, they experience how many people come and go, and perhaps that gives them insight. Elizabeth nodded, and with a gesture, Caspar made sure that none of the others spoke. There are exactly two ways of becoming wise. One way is to travel out into the world and to see as much of God's creation as possible. The other is to put down roots in one spot and study everything that happens there in as much detail as you can. The problem is that it's totally impossible to do both at the same time. Elizabeth was again struck by the wonder at the wise man's words. It's to be on the safe side, she clapped her hands, and the angel and the shepherd did the same. Caspar was infected by their enthusiasm and began clapping too, because he was so pleased with all that had been said. Elizabeth thought it must be fun to keep thinking thoughts that were so clever that people wanted to clap their hands. It was as if the wise man had read her thoughts. Thinking clever thoughts is almost like being at a circus. And I don't mean a circus with clowns and elephants, but I mean the real thinking circus. Let it be said once and for all, however, I am grateful to clowns and elephants for their attention. Joshua thumped his crook on the cobblestones. To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem. The procession began to move along the streets, the sheep, the shepherd, the wise men, the angel, and Elizabeth following. Through the city and out to the country they went, between swaying wheat fields and cool leafy woods. Elizabeth thought Denmark was a very flat country. It seemed to be extra flat because she could see no tall buildings. The only things that pointed up occasionally were the churches they passed. All of them had been built in the honor of a little child who once upon a time was born in Bethlehem. They saw the sea in the distance and came down to a small town called Korsør, which lay beside the Great Belt, the broad sound between Zeeland and Fyn. The people in the small town almost fell over when they glimpsed at the astonishing procession, but their terror lasted only a short time. For the next moment the procession had moved 1 or 2 weeks back in the history of the town. Then there were other people who glimpsed the pilgrimage for a second or two. That's why there was continual talk of angels at that time. Joshua pointed at a large rowboat. We have to borrow that. Hurry up. It's nearly 1,600 years after Jesus. And he chased his sheep on board. Elizabeth felt she had to ask the angel whether This wasn't stealing, but Ephriel reminded her that Jesus had to borrow a donkey when he rode into Jerusalem. A little later, they were out on the great belt. The angel rowed with one oar, King Caspar with the other. The wise men had to work hard to row as strongly as the angel. When Mama came in to look at the calendar, Joachim forgot that he wasn't supposed to talk about what he'd read. She peered at the picture. That must be the Tower of Babel. Oh, no, that's the round tower of Copenhagen. She looked at him in astonishment. Who told you about that? No idea, Joachim replied, because that's what Mama usually said when he asked a question she couldn't answer. Besides, it's impossible to play chess with a tower like that, because it stands stock still. And if you sit in it, you quickly get bored with the view. But on the other hand, you might get insight. Mama clapped her hands. Joachim thought she did it because he said something clever, but all she said was, "Oh, Joachim, where do you get all this from?"